Sir, our store policy strictly prohibits unauthorized insignia. That has to come off, now. The command came from a young store clerk, barely out of adolescence, his voice tinged with disdain. His hand reached toward a dull metal pin on Arthur Kimura's faded jacket. Arthur, 83, stepped back, his own hand rising protectively over the purple heart pinned to his lapel. He didn't flinch, but his old eyes, the deep-set wrinkles that lined his face, sharpened. The pin, worn with years of care, glinted in the dim fluorescent light. "This isn't a thing," Arthur said evenly, his voice quiet but immovable. "It was earned." The clerk snorted, his posture stiff with impatience. He was young, probably fresh from high school, with little concept of what the metal meant. Without warning, he yanked it free from the fabric. The metallic clatter echoed through the sterile air of the mall, a sharp sound that seemed too loud for the moment. "Rules are rules, old man," he muttered, as if somehow that justified the action. Arthur's knuckles tightened around the fabric of his jacket as the metal pin, once a symbol of sacrifice and valor, now lay discarded on the counter. The store had turned its back on history for the sake of protocol. But to Arthur, this moment, this small indignity, was not just an attack on his metal, it was a blow to everything he had once believed was worth fighting for. The young clerk didn't wait for a response, stepping away to ring up the next customer. He had no idea of the man he'd just humiliated. Arthur's heart beat heavy in his chest, but his face remained still, a mask of stoic silence. He didn't argue. He wouldn't waste his breath. This wasn't about words. It was about respect, something that couldn't be demanded in a store, but something earned in the trenches of war. Arthur turned, walked slowly toward the exit, and let the door chime softly behind him. Arthur Kimura had learned silence early. It had been forced upon him as a child when, at the age of 7, he and his family were uprooted from their home in California and sent to an internment camp. His parents, Japanese immigrants, had watched with helpless eyes as the government, in the grip of paranoia and prejudice, branded them as threats to national security. For years, they lived in barracks surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards, with little more than a scrap of earth to call their own. In the face of it all, Arthur's father had always told him to stay quiet. "In silence, there is strength," he would say, his voice low and weary. So, Arthur learned to keep his head down, to speak only when spoken to, and to endure. As a teenager, that silence became his armor. He didn't argue when his high school friends mocked his heritage. He didn't respond when he saw the signs, "No Japs allowed," pinned to the windows of businesses that had once welcomed him. He swallowed every insult, every unspoken prejudice, and he carried it with him. It wasn't until the war came, and he enlisted at 18, that he understood what silence could cost. In the heat of the Korean War, Arthur found himself serving as an infantryman in the 7th Cavalry. The days blurred together in a haze of sweat, blood, and exhaustion. But one day, May 17, 1952, it all changed. They had been ordered to take Hill 347, a strategic position that had been fortified by enemy forces. The hill was a barren ridge, jagged and steep, with a clear view of the surrounding valley. From the moment they began their ascent, Arthur knew it was a suicide mission. The Chinese soldiers had dug in deep, and the hill was a killing ground. The battle was brutal. Arthur lost count of how many men fell around him. It felt as though the world had been reduced to the harsh crack of rifles and the whistling sound of mortar shells. The air tasted of cordite and blood. As the day wore on, Arthur's unit found themselves pinned down. It was then that he saw them, the two men, crouched low behind a boulder, their faces pale with fear. The mortar rounds were falling too close. Without thinking, he moved toward them. His legs burned with exhaustion, his lungs screaming for air, but he ignored it. He crawled through the open ground, pulling one of the men to safety. The other was already gone, his life snuffed out by a direct hit. In the chaos, Arthur could only hold the man's body in his arms, feeling the warm blood seeping into his uniform. He didn't speak, he didn't cry out. He just carried him, dragging him out of the firestorm, with no regard for his own life. It was for this act of bravery that Arthur earned the Purple Heart. But even then, he never spoke of it. The medal, a simple decoration of sacrifice, was just a piece of metal to him, something he had earned, yes, but something he didn't want to wear or flaunt. It was a reminder of the lives he couldn't save, the men he had lost, and the family he had left behind to fight in a war he never truly understood. And so, after returning from the war, Arthur went back to his life, quiet and unassuming. He kept his medals hidden in a drawer, his memories locked away like an old photograph. The world around him had changed, but for Arthur, it was enough to simply survive. The world owed him nothing, and in his heart, he owed it even less. Except for one day each year, the anniversary of Hill 347, when he would pin the Purple Heart to his jacket and walk the streets alone. Just for a few hours, he would wear it, a small act of remembrance. A silent tribute to the men who never came back. That was his way. Quiet. Stoic. Invisible. Until today. It was on the anniversary of the Hill 347 assault that Arthur found himself, as usual, in a store at Valley Ridge Mall. He didn't often go out anymore, his knees ached from the years of military service, and the world had a way of moving too quickly for him to keep up. But on this day, the one day he allowed himself to remember, he made his way to the mall. He wasn't sure what he needed. Maybe new orthopedic shoes. Maybe just the solace of routine. Either way, he pinned the Purple Heart to his jacket, as he did each year, a quiet act of remembrance that no one ever asked for. It was his tribute, and his alone. The store was busy, the hum of people browsing and chatting filling the air. Arthur walked slowly through the aisles, running his fingers along the shelves of shoes. He took his time, inspecting every pair, just as he had on the last anniversary. There was no rush today. Today, he could pretend the world hadn't moved on without him. Today, he could pretend his memories still mattered. He found a pair of shoes that felt right, something comfortable for his aching feet. The register was at the back of the store, near the front windows. As he approached, he saw the young clerk again. The one from before. Kyle, the name tag read. Arthur had noticed him earlier, but hadn't thought much of it. He just wanted to buy his shoes and go home. But as he reached the counter, something changed in the air. The clerk's eyes shifted to the medal on Arthur's chest, his gaze hardening. There was no greeting, no small talk. Just a stiff, almost dismissive glance. Arthur set the shoes down on the counter and pulled out his wallet. Kyle looked at the medal again, this time with open distaste. Company policy doesn't allow unapproved pins, he said, his voice thick with condescension. Doesn't matter if it's Halloween or Veterans Day. No pins. He leaned in a little too close, his breath carrying the faint scent of cheap cologne. His eyes didn't meet Arthur's, they just flicked from the medal to the counter as though it was an inconvenience. Arthur's hand instinctively rose to his chest, where the medal lay. He didn't speak for a moment. What could he say that would make this young man understand? That the medal wasn't just a piece of metal? That it wasn't just some decoration to be dismissed? It had cost something. It had cost lives. And it meant more than anything this kid could ever fathom. I'm sorry, Arthur began, his voice low, yet steady. This medal isn't just a pin. It was earned, on Hill 347, in Korea. It's not something I wear for show. It's a reminder. Please. But Kyle wasn't listening. He was too busy flipping through the register, eyes narrowed, impatience building in his face. Arthur's words hung in the air like an old war cry that no one heard anymore. He tried again. You don't understand. This was earned in combat. But the clerk interrupted, his voice rising slightly. Doesn't matter. We've got rules here. And I can't let you pay with that pin on. Take it off, or I'll have to call the manager. A knot twisted in Arthur's stomach. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like a fist. His fingers tightened on the edge of the counter. The other customers, milling about, seemed to notice, but not one spoke up. A few glanced at him, then turned away. He was just another old man, another face in the crowd. And his medal? Just another piece of flair. Arthur shook his head. I can't do that. Then I'll do it for you. Before he could react, the clerk reached across the counter, grabbing the purple heart from his lapel. The movement was quick and violent. Arthur barely had time to flinch. The pin was torn from his jacket with a swift jerk, the clasp snapping free with a sharp, metallic click. It fell to the counter with a loud clang, a sound that seemed to echo in the sterile space of the store. Kyle looked down at the medal with indifference, as if it were no more important than any other piece of junk. See? Now we're in compliance. He shoved the medal to the side, picking up the shoes without a second glance. Arthur stood there, stunned. His hands shook slightly, but not from fear, just from the weight of the insult. He had been stripped of something he held sacred. It wasn't about the pin. It was about what it represented. And this boy, this stranger, had just taken it from him like it was nothing. Arthur's legs felt like they might give out beneath him as he walked toward the exit. The crowd in the store blurred past him, their lives continuing on, unimpacted by what had just happened. He could feel the eyes of others on him, some curious, others disinterested, but no one said a word. No one spoke up, as though it was perfectly normal for an old man to be humiliated in the middle of a retail store. His feet dragged, each step heavier than the last, but he couldn't bring himself to turn around, to confront Kyle again. Not now. Not when it would only give more weight to the injustice he felt. The air outside was cool, but it offered no comfort. Arthur stepped through the automatic door, the sound of the chime ringing like a distant, hollow echo. The world outside felt so different from the one he had just walked away from. The mall parking lot was full of cars, and in the distance, the hum of everyday life continued, people laughing, talking, walking. They were all part of a world that moved at a pace he couldn't quite follow anymore. It had been that way for years. The world had kept turning, kept moving forward, while he remained stuck in the past, tethered to the memories of a time he could never shake. He made his way to a bench just outside the mall, his body growing more tired with each step. His legs felt like lead, as though every muscle had been drained of its strength. He sat down heavily, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, breathing in the crisp air. His fingers, still numb from the shock, slowly curled around the purple heart now resting in his palm. He hadn't noticed it at first, but as his hand wrapped around it, the sharp edges of the metal pricked at his skin, a small but painful reminder of the injury that had marked his soul so many years ago. He looked down at the metal, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The sight of it, the once proud decoration, now seemed tarnished, not just by the scuff marks and dents but by the weight of the disrespect it had just been subjected to. The cold, hard reality of the moment began to settle in. This wasn't just about a medal. This was about a lifetime of service, of sacrifice, and the people who refused to see it. His heart pounded in his chest, but his anger wasn't immediate. There was a hollow ache in him instead, an emptiness that he didn't know how to fill. He wasn't just angry at Kyle. No, it went deeper than that. He was angry at the world, at how quickly it had moved on from the men who fought, from the wars that were already fading into the past. He was angry that he, too, was being forgotten. His generation, the men who had endured the horrors of war and returned with pieces of themselves broken, was slowly being erased from history, written off as old and irrelevant. Arthur knew it wasn't just the clerk. It wasn't just the insult. It was everything that led up to this moment. The things he had lived through. The things he had seen. His fingers tightened around the metal, and for a brief moment, he wished he could tear it apart, hurl it into the distance. But the thought didn't last long. He didn't want to destroy it. It had meant something once. It still did. But the world? It no longer cared. He reached into his jacket pocket, his movements slow and deliberate, as he pulled out his phone. His fingers trembled slightly as he unlocked the screen and found Hannah's contact. His daughter. His only child. The one person who would understand. The one person he could rely on when the world had turned its back on him. He pressed the call button, his thumb hovering for just a second before he let it fall. The line clicked, and Hannah's voice came through. It was familiar, comforting in its softness, but there was a certain edge to it now, a calm professionalism he had come to know over the years. "Dad?" she asked, the concern clear even through the distance. Arthur's throat tightened, and he fought to steady his voice. He had never been good with words, especially when it came to his feelings. But today was different. Today, he couldn't just let it go. It's nothing, Hannah. Just a small thing. I just need to tell you." But even as he said the words, he knew they weren't true. It wasn't nothing. He had to tell her, or he would never make sense of what had just happened. The frustration, the humiliation, it all needed to be spoken aloud, or it would fester inside him forever. "It was that clerk at the store," Arthur continued, his voice low but steady. He took my medal. Ripped it off me. In front of everyone. Like it was nothing. His chest tightened with the memory, the injustice of it rising again, raw and unrelenting. He fought to keep his voice steady. He said it was company policy. That it didn't matter what it meant. That it wasn't allowed. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. He could hear her breathing, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped entirely. The distance between them, the years that had grown between them since she enlisted, since she rose through the ranks, none of that mattered now. She was his daughter, and she would never stand by while someone disrespected him. Then, with quiet finality, Hannah spoke. "I'm on my way." Arthur didn't protest. There was no point. He knew his daughter, knew how her words became action. When she said she would do something, it was done. He could hear the steel in her voice, the resolve that had been there since she was a young girl. The same resolve that had driven her to join the Marines, to fight for a cause much larger than herself. Arthur hung up the phone slowly, and for the first time since the incident, he felt something shift inside of him. It wasn't the anger he had expected. It wasn't the humiliation either. No. What he felt now was a strange calm. A quiet acceptance. He wasn't alone in this. Hannah would be there. She would stand with him, as she always had, and that made everything feel just a little more bearable. He stood from the bench, the weight of the moment pressing on his shoulders, but his legs felt steadier now. He wasn't walking back into that store as an old man, a relic of a past that no one cared about. He was walking back as a man who had earned respect, and if they didn't understand that, he would make them. 20 minutes later, the doors of the Valley Ridge Mall opened again. This time, it wasn't just another shopper entering, it was Hannah Kimura. Her marine dress blues were sharp, the silver oak leaf on her collar gleaming in the overhead lights. She moved with the grace and discipline of someone who had been forged in the crucible of military service, and there was an undeniable authority in her every step. Two fellow officers flanked her, their presence a silent declaration that this wasn't a moment for the faint-hearted. Hannah's eyes scanned the store, sharp and unwavering. Her gaze locked immediately onto Kyle, who was still standing behind the counter, flipping through a magazine, his eyes averted from the unfolding situation. When their gazes met, there was no question of hesitation. The confidence and composure she exuded was enough to stop him in his tracks. "Are you the employee who removed a combat decoration from a veteran's chest?" Hannah asked, her voice steady but carrying a weight that seemed to fill the room. Kyle froze. His lips parted, but no sound came out. He looked from Hannah to the officers and then back to her, confusion clouding his face. Who are you? He stammered, clearly rattled. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Hana Kimura, she said, her voice unwavering. I'm with the United States Marine Corps. I'm also the daughter of Private First Class Arthur Kimura, 7th Cavalry, Korea, 1952. She paused, letting her words sink in. And that medal you ripped off my father's chest? It's not just flair. It's blood. Her words, though calm, hit with the force of a hammer. Kyle blinked, his face going pale, and for the first time, he seemed to fully grasp the gravity of the situation. He opened his mouth again, but no words came. His bravado, so clear moments earlier, had melted into unease. I didn't mean, he began weakly. Doesn't matter, Hannah interrupted, her voice cutting through his apology like a sharp edge. What matters is that you didn't stop to think. You didn't ask, you didn't care. That medal means more than you'll ever understand, but you'll learn what it means now. She stepped closer to the counter, the space between them charged with tension. I'm here to make sure you understand. At that moment, the manager appeared, rushing out from the back office, his face red and frazzled. It was clear he had heard the commotion and was now trying to manage the fallout. He hesitated for a second before addressing Hannah. I'm terribly sorry, ma'am, the manager said, his voice thick with discomfort. This will not stand. I'll take care of this immediately. Hannah didn't even glance at him. Her focus remained on Kyle, her eyes never wavering. You see, she continued, her voice still calm but growing firmer, my father came here for shoes. He came here looking for comfort. Instead, he was humiliated. You don't get to dismiss that, not with some half-baked apology. Kyle shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the other officers beside Hannah, who stood silently with arms crossed. There was no one around to support him, no one to shield him from the inevitable reckoning. You'll apologize to my father, Hannah said, her words a command. And I expect that apology to be genuine, not some scripted nonsense. Kyle's hands were trembling now, and his eyes flicked nervously to the store's other customers, who had gathered around to witness the scene. No one was offering sympathy. The weight of his actions was starting to sink in. I didn't know, Kyle muttered, his voice barely audible. I didn't know it meant that much. No, you didn't, Hannah replied sharply. And that's the problem. But now you know. The manager spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. We'll issue a formal apology, and we'll make sure this doesn't happen again. I'll ensure that the staff is trained on how to handle veterans with respect. Hannah's eyes narrowed. Training isn't enough. This is a matter of respect. It's not something that can be fixed with a few lectures. There was a long pause, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. Finally, Kyle stepped forward, his face pale, his voice shaking. I'm sorry, sir, he said, turning to Arthur, who stood quietly beside Hannah. I didn't realize. I'm really sorry for what I did. Arthur said nothing at first. He just stood there, his gaze steady on Kyle. For a moment, it seemed like the years of silence had taken their toll, and Arthur's eyes softened. The apology was enough, not perfect, not grand, but genuine in its own way. The manager stepped in again, clearly eager to move past the incident. As a sign of goodwill, he said, we'll extend a lifetime store-wide discount for any inconvenience caused. Hannah nodded but didn't smile. I appreciate that, but that doesn't fix the real problem. Arthur's fingers tightened around the medal on his chest, but his expression remained calm. This was enough. The truth had been spoken, and justice, however small, had been served. I'm leaving, Arthur said quietly, turning toward the door. Hannah placed a hand gently on his arm. Let's get you lunch, Dad. Somewhere quiet. And with that, they left the store, the tension in the air dissipating. The world, it seemed, had heard the truth. The next time someone tried to dismiss what had been earned, they would remember this moment. Justice had been done. Arthur stood quietly outside the store, his shoes now fitting better than ever, but there was still an emptiness in his chest. His hand rested gently on the metal, now firmly back on his lapel. His daughter, Hannah, was by his side, her presence a steady anchor in the wake of the storm that had just passed. She had always been like this, unflappable, resolute, a force of nature. Arthur couldn't help but feel a strange comfort knowing that, even after all these years, she was still fighting battles for him, just as she had when she was a child, always ready to stand up for what was right. The manager's apology, the lifetime discount, the promises of veteran awareness training, it was all a blur now. In the end, it wasn't those gestures that mattered. It was the simple fact that he had been heard, that his dignity had been restored, even if only for a brief moment. As they walked toward the parking lot, Hannah's arm linked with his, a silent reassurance that he wasn't alone. They didn't speak much. The silence between them was comfortable, familiar, even. There was no need for more words. Arthur could feel the weight of the day in his bones, the sting of the insult still lingering, but the sting was dulled now, overshadowed by something stronger. Something he hadn't expected to feel today. Pride. Not for himself, necessarily, but for his daughter. For the woman she had become. He had watched her grow from a quiet, determined girl into a leader, a woman who commanded respect wherever she went. She was more than just his daughter. She was a reflection of the values he had tried to instill in her, the strength he had carried through the years, and the lessons learned on foreign soil, far from home. Arthur thought back to those days on Hill 347, the chaos, the blood, the screams that still haunted his dreams. It had been a different world then. The medals, the honors, they were supposed to mean something. They were supposed to serve as a reminder of the sacrifices made. But in a world that had moved on, where history was often forgotten, it felt as if those medals, his Purple Heart, were no more than relics. Trinkets. Things that people saw and didn't understand. But today, he had felt the power of those memories again. It wasn't just the medal. It was the respect it commanded. It was the way the world shifted when his daughter stood there, unwavering, demanding that the past be acknowledged. For once, the world had stopped to listen. And for that, he was grateful. As they reached the car, Hannah helped him into the passenger seat. She leaned in, her face softening for the first time since they had walked into the store. "Let's get you lunch, Dad," she said, her voice warmer now, the hard edge of her earlier words gone. "Somewhere quiet." Arthur nodded, watching as she closed the door and circled the car to the driver's side. The engine roared to life, and for the first time in a long while, Arthur allowed himself to lean back in the seat, the tension in his body slowly easing away. The drive to the small diner they frequented wasn't long. It was a quiet place, nestled in a corner of the city where time seemed to slow down. A place where no one cared about medals or honors. A place where, for a few hours, Arthur could just be. They sat at their usual booth, the same one they always took when they came here. The waitress, a familiar face, brought them their usual orders without needing to ask. Hannah sat across from him, her face softened now, though her eyes still held the fire of someone who fought for what was right. Arthur was content to let her lead the conversation. He didn't have to talk if he didn't want to. She knew that. But after a few moments, Hannah spoke, her tone more casual than before. "I'm proud of you, Dad. You didn't let that kid get away with it." Arthur looked up from his plate, meeting her gaze. "It wasn't about the kid, Hannah. It was about showing him, and everyone else, that there's more to this life than rules and policies. Sometimes, you have to stand up for what's right. Even if no one else will." Hannah nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass as she thought. "I know. I saw it, Dad. You were more than just a man with a medal. You were the man who earned that medal, and everything it stood for." Arthur took a deep breath, letting the words settle in his chest. They were quiet, but they were everything. In his daughter's eyes, he wasn't just a veteran from a forgotten war. He wasn't just some old man trying to hold on to a past that seemed to slip further away with each passing year. To her, he was still a man of honor. A man who had fought, who had sacrificed. And in that moment, Arthur felt something inside him stir, a quiet, almost imperceptible joy that had eluded him for so long. The rest of the afternoon passed in comfortable silence, the two of them sharing stories, reminiscing, and simply enjoying each other's company. When the check came, Arthur reached for his wallet, but Hannah was quicker. She paid without a word, and as they left the diner, Arthur noticed that the sun had begun to set, casting a warm glow across the sky. As they walked to the car, Hannah stopped and turned to him. "You know, Dad," she said, her voice thoughtful, "sometimes I think we forget that honor isn't something we wear. It's something we live." Arthur smiled, the weight of the years easing just a little more. "Maybe so," he replied, "but it sure feels good to have it recognized now and then." And with that, father and daughter made their way home, the day's events already becoming a part of the past, but with a renewed sense of what truly mattered, respect, honor, and the legacy they carried forward together. Honor remembered.